This experience happened a few years ago, when I was still working with the restoration of historic properties. One of the oldest houses I worked on was in a small town in Connecticut, a three-story mansion built in the late 19th century, surrounded by trees and surrounded by a strange air of isolation. I had the habit of visiting the rooms alone, taking pictures to catalog details of the furniture and original finishes. It was in one of these visits that I noticed a different door from the others, more worn, with an old and rusty doorknob, and curiously locked from the inside. I asked the person in charge of the place about that room, and he said that, according to the records, no one had been there for decades. The room had been closed by decision of former owners, and no one knew for sure why. Of course, that only increased my curiosity. I spent days thinking about it, until on a quiet afternoon, I decided to try to open it. With a little force and the help of an improvised key, the lock finally gave way with a sharp snap. The air that came out of there was dense, cold, as if time had stopped. The light of the flashlight revealed old clothes hanging on a coat rack, faded cardboard boxes, and an iron bed covered by a yellowish sheet. On the table, open letters, handwritten, some stained with something that looked like moisture. It was as if the resident had left in a hurry and never came back. I spent a long time exploring the place, taking pictures, until a detail bothered me: the mirror. It was big, old, and it was to the wall, as if someone had made a point of hiding it. That gave me a strange chill, but I didn't give it much importance. I closed the door and went down. At night, I stayed at the house as part of the work contract. There were renovated rooms for the restaurateurs. I slept on the second floor, not far from that locked room. The mansion was silent, except for occasional snats of the wood. Around 2 in the morning, I began to hear light footsteps in the hallway. At first I thought it was another employee, but the steps stopped right in front of my door. The sound was there for long seconds, only that soft creak of the floor under weight, then the absolute silence. When I finally got up the courage to open the door, the hallway was empty. The air, however, seemed different, colder and charged. I went back to bed trying to ignore it, but then I heard something that made me freeze. Whispers coming from the direction of the locked room. They were low, dragged, almost incomprehensible, as if someone spoke through a wall. I took the flashlight and walked down the corridor with my heart racing. When I pointed the light at the bedroom door, I realized something that made me stop. The door was ajar. I clearly remembered having closed it. I entered slowly, holding the flashlight, trembling. Everything was as before, except for one detail: the mirror. He was now facing forward, reflecting the room. And for a brief moment, I swear I saw something pass behind me in the reflection. I turned around quickly, but there was no one. I left that room as fast as I could and locked the door again. The next day, I commented on what happened with the caretaker, and he just looked at me seriously. He said that, when he was a child, he had already heard stories about the Room of the Forgotten. They told that the eldest son of the family who lived there disappeared one night, and that the room has been locked since then. I never slept in that mansion again after that. But every time I look at the photos I took that day, I feel the same chill. In one of them, taken before I left the room, there is something reflected in the mirror glass, a light, curved, almost human silhouette, exactly where no one else was with me. Story 2. I've always liked old places. I grew up watching videos of urban explorations, and when I turned 17, I started looking for abandoned houses and buildings with my friends. That Victorian mansion in the interior of New York was one of the most talked about in exploration forums, and they said it had already belonged to a rich family that suddenly disappeared, leaving everything behind. It was one of those stories that we hear and think is an exaggeration, until the day we went to see it with our own eyes. The house was far from the city, surrounded by twisted trees and an iron fence almost all taken by rust. It was the end of October, the beginning of autumn, and the air was already wet and cold. There were 4 of us: me, Will, Jenna, and Ryan. We entered from the side, where one of the ground floor windows was broken, and soon we were greeted by that typical smell of mold and old wood. The floorboards clashed with each step, and the echo of the sound seemed to fill the whole place. After exploring the first and second floors, we thought there was nothing else interesting, until Ryan noticed a small door at the end of the corridor, partially hidden by a fallen piece of furniture. It was smaller than the others, as if it were from a built-in closet. When we pulled, we saw that it led to a stone staircase going down to the basement. The air that came out of there was cold and humid, almost suffocating. The detail is that there was a rusty chain holding the doorknob, with an old padlock. For some stupid reason, perhaps pure curiosity, we decided to break the padlock with an iron bar we found in the kitchen. After a few blows, the chain came loose and the door opened with a low moan, as if protesting. Jenna hesitated to go down, but the boys and I went ahead with the lanterns. The steps were made of stone and were covered by a thick layer of dust and dry leaves. The staircase ended in a short corridor that led to a wooden door. When we pushed, she opened easily. The flashlight lit up what looked like an old game room. There was a small table in the center, several small chairs, and toys scattered, porcelain dolls, metal carts, and a deck scattered on the floor. The air was different there, warmer, and there was a sweet smell, like a melted candle mixed with something rotten. The strangest thing is that the toys were not covered in dust like the rest of the house. The dolls seemed clean, and the letters kind of too new. We'll joke that someone should live there, but no one laughed. That place seemed active somehow. While we were taking pictures, we heard a sound coming from the corner of the room, something like a ball rolling slowly. We all turned at the same time and saw a red ball stop right next to the table, as if it had been pushed. The silence that followed was suffocating. No one said anything for a few good seconds, until Ryan, trying to look calm, said, "It must have fallen off some shelf." But there was no shelf there. We continued walking around the room, trying to ignore the discomfort. That's when Jenna commented in a low voice that she was hearing something coming from the hallway, a rhythmic sound, like slow steps up the stairs. Will laughed, but the sound wouldn't stop. We went to the entrance and pointed the lanterns. The corridor was completely empty. No movement. But the steps kept echoing, getting closer and closer. Ryan was the first to run back to the room, and when we followed him, we noticed something that wasn't there before. The deck that was spread out before now formed a straight row on the floor, with the cards facing up, all showing the same suit, crowns. That made Jenna start crying, and I could only think about getting out of there. We ran to the stairs, but when I got to the top and pushed the door, it wouldn't open. I hit hard, screamed for Will, who pushed along, but it was as if something on the other side held her. The steps started again down there, now running fast, heavy, going up the stairs. Jenna shouted someone's name, but she couldn't understand. I closed my eyes and pushed with all my strength, until the door gave way, and we fell almost together on the floor of the hallway of the house. The air outside seemed fresh again, but the sound still echoed, as if it had been trapped inside. We fled without looking back, and only when we were already in the car, with the headlights on, we realized something. The rear window had a hand mark, very sharp, made of dirt, as if someone had touched it inside. Days later, Ryan returned there with another group, and sent me a message saying that the basement door was again locked with a chain. The same one we had broken. And according to him, he had scratched on the wall, next to the stairs, a sentence written in chalk. "Come back to finish the game." Story 3. I've always liked photographing old places. I have a strange attraction to constructions that seem to have stopped in time, perhaps because of the silence, or the feeling that something got stuck there. Last fall, I booked a historic mansion in the interior of Connecticut that was available for rental by artists and photographers. The owner mentioned that the house was from 1890 and that the highlight was the Winter Garden, a huge greenhouse, all glass, full of exotic plants. It seemed perfect for the project I was doing. I arrived on a cloudy afternoon around 4. The place was beautiful, but it carried a strange, heavy atmosphere. The windows were covered with dust, and the air inside the house had that smell of humidity and wet earth. The janitor gave me the keys, showed me the Winter Garden, and warned me that he would return only the next day. I got excited. The iron and glass structure was impressive, a mixture of beauty and abandonment, with vines climbing up the columns and fallen leaves covering the ground. While mounting the tripod, I realized that, despite the closed weather, the interior was too hot, almost stuffy. The plants seemed alive in a strange way. Some moved slightly, even without wind. I ignored it and started photographing. The sound of the fine rain hitting the glass panels created an almost hypnotic rhythm. When it got dark, I turned on the main lights, but half of them didn't work. I ended up leaving only a portable lamp on, near the central wooden bench. The environment gained a yellowish tone, and the shadows of the leaves projected on the glass walls, forming distorted silhouettes. That's when I realized something. Among the shadows, one of them didn't move with the others. At first, I thought it was a larger plant, or maybe a statue, but as I looked better, it looked like a human silhouette, standing still near the entrance. When I blinked, the shadow disappeared. I took a deep breath and went back to work, trying not to get carried away. Around 8 o'clock at night, the wind increased, and the sound of the leaves beating against the glass began to look different. Almost like whispers, long dragged. I turned off the camera and kept listening. It was a low sound, coming from different corners of the greenhouse, impossible to distinguish words. I took the cell phone and recorded an audio, thinking it could be the wind passing through cracks, but the sound seemed to be formed by voices, really. I decided to turn on all the lights at once, just to make sure I wasn't imagining. When I turned on the switch, the noise stopped. Everything was in absolute silence. But one thing made me freeze. In the center of the winter garden there was an old iron chair, and it was spinning slowly, as if someone had just gotten up. I approached with my heart racing, trying to find a logical explanation. I touched the chair, it was hot. The surrounding floor, however, was covered by small shoe marks, as if someone had walked in circles. I was taken by a horrible feeling of being watched. I took the things in a hurry, and went up to the mansion room, trying to convince myself that it was just tiredness. I locked the door, but sleep didn't come. Around midnight, I heard that muffled sound again, coming from below, the metallic creak of the spinning chair. With each turn, the sound seemed louder. I took courage and went down slowly, with my cell phone in my hand, recording. The corridor was dark, and only the flash of the moon entered through the garden windows. When I got to the glass door, I could clearly see the chair swinging back and forth alone. I took a step back and almost dropped my cell phone. That's when I noticed something reflected in the glass, a human form, with my back to me, standing between the plants. A woman, in an old dress, staring at the chair. The light flashed, and in a second, everything stopped. The chair, the reflection, the sound. Everything. The next morning, the janitor arrived and found me already with my suitcases ready. I showed the video I recorded. He watched in silence, and then said, "This chair belonged to the first owner's wife. They say she died waiting for her husband to return from the war. He never came back, and since then, no one likes to shoot here at night." I looked out the window before leaving. The chair was still there, in the same place, facing the entrance, as if waiting for someone to sit. Story 4. I've always been fascinated by ancient art. I work as a photographer of historical interiors, and I have visited dozens of preserved mansions in the United States, but none marked me as much as that house in Chicago. It had belonged to a wealthy family from the late 19th century, and the current heiress, an elderly lady, hired me to record the interior before a major restoration. When I arrived, the environment had that typical smell of wet wood and old varnish. The high windows let the light in a beautiful, diffuse way. But there was something strange in that house from the beginning. The air seemed heavier than usual, as if everything there kept a memory that I preferred not to be revived. After a few hours photographing the main floor, I entered a side room that was not on the map of the original plant. It was smaller and darker, with burgundy velvet curtains and several old paintings on the walls. Most portrayed family scenes, typical of portraitists of the period: serious poses, formal clothes, hard looks. But a picture in particular caught my attention. He was in the center of the wall, surrounded by smaller frames, and showed a man with a rigid expression, very clear eyes and a posture that conveyed authority. The detail is that, for some reason, every time I approached, I had the feeling that his gaze changed, as if he followed my movements. I thought it was the angle of lighting or some optical illusion, something common in old paintings with irregular varnish. I took some photos from afar, then I approached to capture the details of the screen texture. I approached the lens, clicked 3 times, and went to another room. The strange thing was that, when I looked at the photos in the camera viewfinder, I had the impression that the face was slightly different in each image. The more inclined look, the shadow of the altered mouth, almost imperceptible but real. I put the camera away, and tried to convince myself that I was tired. I worked until dusk, registering the upper rooms, and at night I stayed in one of the guest rooms of the house itself, with the owner's authorization. She mentioned that no one had slept there for years, and wished me a quiet night. It took me a while to sleep. The house creaked all the time, and the wind made noises that sounded like footsteps. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up with the feeling that someone had turned on the light in the hallway. I opened the bedroom door, and noticed a yellowish glow coming from the room where the paintings were. I went down slowly, thinking that the automatic lighting system could have triggered. But when I arrived, the light was off, and yet, the man's painting was slightly turned, pointing at another angle. I felt a chill run down my spine. I approached and noticed that up close, the face looked different, the most tense expression, the eyes fixed on me, as if there was a silent anger there. I went back to the room, closed the door, and stayed up until dawn. The next morning, I decided to review the photos from the previous day. On the laptop, I opened the sequence of images from that room. In each of them, the portrait was with a different head position. In the first click, he looked slightly forward. In the second, the head was turned to the left. In the third, the gaze was turned directly to the camera. I tried to convince myself that I had moved the lens or changed the position, but the proportions of the background were identical. The frame had not been photographed from different angles. It was as if the portrait itself had moved. I decided to tell the owner of the house, kind of embarrassed. When I showed the photos, she looked carefully and said something that froze my blood. "This has been happening since my grandfather died. He hated being photographed. He said that the soul was trapped in every image." She laughed, trying to break the mood, but her eyes were watery. "He said that the portrait always changed when someone photographed it, and that he preferred that I delete it from the records." Later, while putting away the equipment, I noticed something that made me stop. The memory card had been formatted by itself, as if someone had deleted all the photos from the previous night. I went back to the room for one last look. The portrait was the same man, the same hard look. But this time, there was a new detail. In the lower corner of the screen, the reflection of a camera, just like mine. Story 4. I've always liked old houses, especially those that still keep their original objects. There is something in them that seems to contain pieces of time, almost as if the walls still remember what has already happened. At the end of last year, I visited an abandoned mansion in Philadelphia, which had belonged to a family of musicians. I went with a small group of fellow photographers. The idea was to document the rooms before the place was completely renovated. The house was huge, with high windows and heavy dust-covered curtains. The smell of old wood and mold was so strong that it seemed to stick to the clothes. Right at the entrance, a corridor led to a large room, and right in the center of it was a black grand piano, covered by a thin layer of dust. The walls still kept framed scores and faded portraits of people with serious expression. It seemed that, at some point, someone had simply gotten up and left everything there, waiting for a return that never happened. I approached the piano and ran my hand over the lid. The touch raised a light cloud of dust, and a low, almost imperceptible sound echoed, a single loose note, probably a result of the weight of the wood adjusting. Even so, that made me retreat. I photographed the instrument from several angles, but I confess that I didn't feel comfortable. The air in that room was different, colder, as if it didn't belong to the rest of the house. When it got dark, everyone decided to leave. I stayed a little longer, reviewing the images in the car before driving back. The photos were normal: windows, furniture, the piano. But one in particular caught my attention. The keys seemed to be pressed in an irregular sequence, as if someone had just played. I enlarged the image and saw that the dust on top of the piano was slightly moved, as if fingers had passed through there. I was sure I hadn't touched him. I tried to forget the subject, but that photo bothered me for days. I returned to the place the following week, this time alone, under the pretext of getting more sockets for the project. The house was silent, but the air seemed heavier, almost humid. Upon entering the room, I immediately realized that the piano was open, with the lid raised, and there were clear fingerprints on the keys. It was impossible that anyone had been there. The mansion was sealed since our last visit. I took my cell phone to film, and without thinking, I touched one of the keys. The sound came out clean, too tuned for an instrument that hadn't been used for decades. I left there with the feeling that something was wrong, as if I had interrupted something I shouldn't have. Later, I contacted one of the neighbors who lived on the side street. He was surprised when I mentioned the piano. He said that, as a child, he used to hear sad songs coming from that house at night, even long after the owners had died. According to him, several people have already claimed to hear the same melody, always the same sequence of notes, like an unfinished rehearsal. A few days later, I looked at the original photos again. In one of them, right at the bottom of the reflection of the piano top, I noticed something I hadn't noticed before: a curved silhouette, sitting on the bench, with her back to the camera. I showed the image to one of the colleagues who was with me. He confirmed that no one had sat there during the session. I never went back to that house. Sometimes, when I work late at night and leave the computer on, I think I hear a piano note in the background, a single note, long and clean, that seems to repeat itself. I don't know if it's my head playing tricks, or if I brought something from that visit with me. Story 6. I've always had the habit of visiting old buildings, not out of courage, but out of curiosity. Last fall, I decided to explore a mansion in Vermont, known among local residents as the House of the Moaning Stairs. The nickname came from the constant sound of creaking wood that, according to some, continued even when no one was inside. I thought it was an exaggeration, until the day I stepped on that place. The house was isolated, on top of a hill surrounded by almost bare trees. The wind blew hard, and the broken windows made the air come in like a whisper. I entered through a side door already stewed by boards. The interior was covered with dust and wets, and the smell of mold was almost suffocating. Everything seemed untouched, except for one detail: the footprints. Light, recent marks that went up the main staircase and disappeared on the second floor. I decided to follow the same path. Each step he stepped on released a dry snap, the kind of sound you expect from an old house. But when I got to the middle of the stairs, I heard another noise, lower, rhythmic, coming right behind me. It looked like someone climbing in the same rhythm of my steps, just a second later. I stopped. The sound stopped too. I waited, motionless, holding the handrail covered with dust. The air seemed still, and the only thing I heard was my own heart beating in my ear. So I took another step. Soon after, another identical creak echoed behind me as an answer. I turned quickly, hoping to see a colleague or some intruder, but there was no one. The corridor was empty, and the air heavy. The strangest thing is that, although the stairs were covered with dust, the steps just below me were clean, as if something invisible had just passed. I tried to continue, but the feeling of being followed only got worse. Every time I went up, I heard 2 or 3 more slow, spaced, as if someone went up carefully, accompanying my breathing. When I reached the top, I turned my body and leaned against the wall, pointing the flashlight down. No form, no movement, just the empty staircase, illuminated in parts, as if hiding something among the shadows. I entered one of the rooms on the upper floor, trying to calm down. The curtains moved slightly with the wind coming in through the cracks. I took the cell phone and recorded the sound, and that's when I realized that, even though I was stopped, the microphone picked up the same snats on the stairs. I closed the bedroom door and was silent for a few minutes, trying to reason. The sound stopped. When I returned to the corridor, there was nothing else, but the wood of the handrail was damp, as if hands had passed there recently. On the way out, I looked back one last time. Outside, with the sunset light crossing the broken windows, I swear I saw the shadow of someone standing at the top of the stairs, motionless, as if watching who dared to return. A few days later, I showed the recording to a friend who understands audio. He called me hours later, scared. He said that, when increasing the volume between the snats, you could hear a light and constant breathing, very close to the microphone. Since then, I have never entered a house where the stairs creak. Story 7. I've always been fascinated by ancient places, the smell of aged wood, the objects that seem to keep stories, and that silence that only forgotten houses have. At the beginning of the year, I visited an old mansion in the countryside of Ohio, a Victorian mansion that, according to the broker, had been empty for more than 40 years. I was photographing historic properties for a personal project, and that one looked perfect. The current owner, a distant heir, allowed me to spend a night there, as long as I didn't touch anything structural. I agreed without thinking twice. As soon as I entered, I felt that stuffy and humid air, as if time didn't circulate in there. The furniture was covered with sheets, and the floor, full of marks from the past, scratches, stains, and even small rat footprints. I walked slowly through the rooms until I reached a side corridor, narrow and dark, where I noticed a door different from the others, small, with an iron lock and rusty chains crossing the stop. It was a built-in closet, but it looked more like a miniature basement door. My curiosity spoke louder. I used a screwdriver from the backpack to force the lock, and with some effort, I managed to break the lock. The chains fell, making a noise that echoed throughout the house. When I opened the door, the musty smell was so strong that I had to cover my face. Inside there were old clothes hanging, long dresses, fractions, shoes, all covered by a thick layer of powder. In the background, I found a wooden box with personal letters, dating from the 1930s and 1940s. The letters were addressed to a woman named Eleanor, and almost all ended in the same way: "I hope you can get out of there soon." That gave me goosebumps. I photographed the contents, closed the closet, and left it as it was. However, the sound of the currents beating still echoed in my head. At night, I set up my small camp upstairs, in the old master bedroom. Around midnight, when the wind began to hit the windows hard, I heard something that made my heart freeze. The clear sound of chains dragging from the corridor. It sounded like the same noise I heard when I opened the closet. I stood still, trying to rationalize, thinking it was the wind. But soon after, I heard the sound of the iron beating, as if someone was trying to open something. I took my cell phone and went to the hallway with the flashlight on. The closet was closed, but the chains I had left on the floor were now stuck again, crossed the same way as before. Only the padlock was different, newer, shining in the dark. I hadn't put that there. I went back to the room with my hands shaking. I spent the rest of the night without sleeping, listening to snaps coming from downstairs. Around 3 in the morning, the sound changed. Now it was a slow door creak, opening and closing, opening and closing. I counted at least 6 times before it would stop. When it dawned, I went down to check it out. The closet door was half open, creaking slightly with the wind. Inside, the clothes were on the floor, scattered, and the letters, all, had disappeared. I thought about leaving immediately, but a part of me needed to understand. I called the broker and asked if he knew who Eleanor was. There was a silence on the other end of the line before he answered. This name appears in some old records. They say she was the family maid. He disappeared inside the house. They never found the body. I looked at the closet one last time. At the bottom, where the hangers used to be, there was a rectangular cutout on the wooden panel, like a secret passage. I didn't have the courage to open. That night, I dreamed of the sound of the chains beating again, and when I woke up, I realized that the cell phone was recording by itself. In the audio, you could clearly hear a female voice whispering, "Please close the door." Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.